Thanks so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. I actually brought this picture, and some of you may know some of the people in this picture, but it just kind of screamed to me of all the stuff in my portfolio of like freedom. Those of you guys know U.S. royalty might see John Thornley, Brandon Moses, a couple of the artists here in town, Eric Lofton, some great designers in there. So freedom, wow. At first when like Joel and Jackie asked me to speak on this, I was like, oh yeah, cool, I'll speak at Creative Mornings, no problem. And then I like kind of really let the theme of freedom like sink in a little bit. And I was like, wow, this is a really, really, really big topic, especially talking to fellow creatives. Because it is, as Joel said, this idea that we all have this imagination, this definition for, and what it means in our own lives. And I would imagine, like myself, a lot of you struggle with this every day, and what you want to do with your work and how you want to express yourself. And being here in DC alone, right? It's the town of freedom, right? We kind of like we use it as a huge part of our American identity and who we are. It's sent to us in advertising. It's everywhere. We live and we breathe it. But like, if you sit down and consider it, it becomes a much more kind of difficult concept. So I'm going to talk to you about my own understanding of freedom and kind of how I got there and my own struggles with it. And hopefully find out a little bit about what you're doing too, because I want this to be as interactive as possible. I have way too many pictures. Contextualizing my work is something that I find very difficult to do, so I've just kind of vomited on the screen, and you guys are going to have to keep up with me, okay? Everything is a group therapy session for me, just to warn you. So you should have had on your chair a little piece of blank paper. If you still have it with you, please hold on to it for a second. Those of you that don't have it, let me know. I kind of ripped up some more. You'll need a pen. I'm going to give these to Jackie real quick. Anyone who doesn't have a piece of paper, raise your hand. You're going to need one. And so just to kind of lead into this exercise, I want to, first I kind of got asked to do the talk, and I was like, yeah, freedom, I can talk about freedom. I'm a freelancer, I'm a photographer, I do whatever I want, I'm free. And I just started like kind of going through these like iterations of like what I do, and I was like, wow, this is really boring. And so I started talking to the people around me. First I kind of started talking to a core group, and then I kind of got my ideas formed a little bit around it. But then as I kind of led up to the talk, obviously there's a little anxiety and you want to like talk to people about it. And over the last couple of days, I've had a couple of photo shoots that I've had to do. And even this morning, as I stopped to get my coffee, I kind of talked to people, well, I'm supposed to speak on this concept of freedom. And everybody has something to say about that, which is really interesting. But this morning on my way to get coffee, actually I'm going to get to that concept later. But even as I came up into the elevator later, the lady who was at the security desk when we first arrived, we were in there. And there was a little, I don't know if you guys saw the shop when you come on, called Stand and Snack. And I was like, well, that's kind of a cool idea, but like, I want to sit when I snack. I don't know about you. And she's like, well, you can sit or you can stand. You have that option. I was like, that is freedom. And she was like, yeah, that is freedom. And I was like, no, tell me what freedom means to you. And she's like, freedom to me is doing what you want, when you want, how you want. And I was like, okay, well, that's a broad definition of freedom. But we all know that if we actually lived our lives like that, things wouldn't work out very well, all right? So freedom is like something that's constantly in negotiation, I think, both with our surrounding worlds and with ourselves. So what I want you to do on that piece of paper is write what freedom means to you. Now, hold on a second. No, I don't want your name on it. I want you to like, you guys all wrote these cool, quippy, funny things on your name tag. I want what freedom really means to you. I want you to like kind of get a little bit vulnerable. Nobody's going to know who this is. I want you to think about it. I'll give you like a minute and a half just because I'm compressed for time, even though it's not a lot. But I imagine like maybe by my 5 minutes of rambling, you started to kind of muse on this a little bit. Fold it up, hide it, exchange it with the person next to you. Don't open it. Person next to you, don't open it. Now swap to the next person next to you. Now do it one more time. Now do it one more time. And one more time. Does everyone feel like there's sufficient anonymity at this point? That where we have 6 degrees of separation? I think I may have done 5. Does everyone feel okay? Nobody feels exposed? I do have a couple of handwriting analysts in the audience, so you might be in trouble. Okay, so everybody open it up. Who's got an awesome one? Read through them. You got an awesome one? Yeah, all right. Let's see this. Actually, I'm going to have you read it. I'm tired of talking.
Chance to follow your passion.
Ooh, that's a good one. Who likes that one? Who's got another good one? I know somebody's got a good one. All right.
Freedom is having fun without being trapped by gray people and gray walls.
Who else got a good one?
This person said, freedom means Trey Parker and Matt Stone can make movies about the crazies of the world without being arrested.
That's a really good one. Anyone else? I know. You just read it. What does it say?
Freedom is trust in action, honesty, and purpose.
I like that a lot. What's yours say?
Surrendering.
I really like that.
Being able to travel outside where you live.
All right. So these are all really good ones. So yes, everyone does have an idea of freedom, and everybody wants to know what freedom is. So for me, like at first I was like writing this whole backstory and like where I came from and like my childhood, and then last night I was like, this is really boring. Everyone has a childhood. So my idea is that I'm just gonna like switch, I'm gonna kind of cruise through to how where I got today, and if at any point you want to stop me, there will be embarrassing stories to share that show how silly and goofy and the bad choices I make, so you're welcome to get any of those afterwards. But I basically grew up in the moderately tough streets of Buford Highway in Atlanta, Georgia. And I say moderately tough because it wasn't really tough. It wasn't downtown, but it wasn't like the burbs. And it was like a weird little, I lived in this apartment complex, and we would hang out by the dumpster all the time and play. And it was like, life was pretty good. I felt pretty free. I was like a latchkey kid, right? I don't know if any of you guys know what that is, but like, mine was the generation that parents really started divorcing, so I spent a lot of time at home alone and in my head and watching TV and with all these ideas. And then I was forced to move to suburbia when my mother remarried when I was 14. And suburbia was like, to me, like the antithesis of everything I wanted. It didn't feel like freedom, right? It felt like very kind of uniform. There were all these housing developments that were named after places that they destroyed to put them up, like Lockridge Forest and Deer Meadows and all those type of things. But you never saw any of those things. There were no forests and there were no meadows. I didn't understand it. But I knew that I wanted something different. I knew that I wanted to get out. I was born in '76, so I grew up on Indiana Jones and adventure and this idea of getting out and all these things. I also grew up on a lot of those movies like Return of the Jedi and The Golden Child, and everyone that said like everybody's messianic and special. But as we find out when we grow up, we're not all really that special. But I became very interested at a young age because my grandma, like traveling abroad, she had been a big traveler. My grandfather had been in the military. And when he got out, there was this deal that if you were in the military family, you could take any military flight you wanted anywhere in the world if there was space. And so after my mother and my uncle had gone off to college, my bubby, that's why it starts the Yiddish word for grandmother, I'll use it a couple times because Bubby's a big figure in my life. She traveled all over the place. So I grew up on all these like awesome books and stories of her travels, and that's really kind of like inspired my original wanderlust. And like I had this idea when I went to college, I wanted to do anthropology and archaeology, and it was just stuff that could get me closer to things that were different than me. That's all I wanted. And so I went to college, and then around came junior year, and there was this opportunity to study abroad. I saw my friends started to talk about, say, bro, as I study abroad, I can go get like university credits when I travel, and it turns out I could. So the pictures start. There's only a couple of these requisite ones. First of all, who is that long hair hippie? And why doesn't he get a haircut? So I went to Israel. Jerusalem felt like a place of adventure to me. It lined up with my ideals of archaeology, of old worlds, and differences of faith. And so I went to Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I got there, and immediately I was like, I want a camera. And I didn't know why I wanted a camera. I wish I could say that I had a young aptitude for the arts, but I don't think that I did. I think I had a young aptitude for getting lost in my head. And when I got to Jerusalem, it was like a place that was a physical map of that, you know? And I was able to kind of go out and wander all the streets and the narrow alleys, and it just felt like I should have a camera. So I bought one, and I started shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting, and I just loved it. And finally, there was something that kind of gave me white noise. As you can probably see when I'm up here, I've always been the kid that's been a little ADHD. I never stop moving. I can't ever really relax. I always feel like I have to have something to do. When I have a camera in my hands, I'm actually not nearly as twitchy. And it gave me something that I felt like, all right, I can kind of understand the world through this, and it also really gave me an excuse to hang out with people that I hadn't hung out with before. Now, it may have been that this was just something I was making up in my head, right? That because I had this physical object, it was okay to hang out with people that were very different from me. This was Jerusalem, this was 1997, so it was pre-Second Intifada, and you could wander around pretty openly. So I'd hang out with old Palestinian shopkeepers smoking shisha, and I'd go hang out with Orthodox Jews down at the wall, and I'd hang out with the Greek Orthodox near Nazareth. And I felt like, for the first time, I was like, oh man, I am totally alive. And through this, I just really got to feel like I could connect with the larger world. And this is where I want to talk what my idea of freedom is. My idea of freedom is experiencing as much as I possibly can so that all the world feels safe to me, right? I think we all have boundaries and places that we're afraid to go and not to go. But for me, the way that I would extinguish those boundaries is having the experience, by touching it and feeling it and knowing what it is and understanding it. And I had this big fear when I was leaving Israel that life was never going to get this good again, that I had reached my pinnacle of experience. I was never going to have adventures like this. I'd never experienced like this before in my life, and I just didn't think, I saw everyone kind of going back and getting jobs, and I was like, wow, life is going to get boring from here on. It's a long downhill slide to the grave from this point on, right? And I think we've all had periods in our lives where it's never going to get better than this, and we freak out. That's usually a point that we sometimes take an off-ramp, and we're like, well, I'm not going to go that way. And so I moved to Washington, D.C. with this idea that I was going to work at National Geographic. I had a very myopic vision of what I was going to do. For some reason, I was like, National Geographic, that's the place. I think I knew one manager at one place in the society, but I was convinced that I could move to Washington, D.C. and get a job at National Geographic. Doing what? I had no idea. I didn't really consider it to be photography at this point. And of course, I found work as soon as I got to Washington, D.C. So those of you that haven't been to Adams, Oregon, it's a bar in Adams, Oregon. And I was not able to get work at Geographic when I first moved away. I was able to bartend. So I spent a lot of time around the bar. But through the bar, I met people that worked at Geographic. They would come in. DC was a small town. There was an intranet that would give away job opportunities that people worked inside the society at the time. They would call me up and be like, hey, Josh, maybe you should apply for this. And I probably applied for 4 or 5 different positions and was literally having no luck. So it was either the fact that I looked like a feral half-wolf, or it was the fact that they could tell that my idea of what my job at Geographic was very different from what my job at Geographic would be. But nobody really wanted to hire me. And I was getting really frustrated. And I'd been in DC probably 3-4 months at this point, and I was really starting to be like, oh man, I'm not going to figure it out. All I can get is work as bartending. And I remember calling my grandma with this anxiety, and she was like, well, why don't you offer to work for free? And I was like, oh, okay, work for free. She's like, nobody can turn down free work. Well, as it turns out, nobody can turn down free work. This is really true. In the age of the intern, you guys probably all know this. So I got a job at Geographic in the photo lab. I had basically talked the volunteer coordinator into giving me this little red badge that basically got me in through security and let me into the building, and I just started showing up. Nicole Shea is back there. She was an editor at Geographic at the time, and she can attest to the fact that I would just hang out. I didn't really have much to do. I'd say, hey, you guys got any film, or you need anything? And I just kind of loiter around. And at the same time, though, I got free film and free pictures, which is the best thing you can do if you're a photographer, right? Also, all the heroes were coming in there, right? So David Dubélé and Steve McCurry, and endless name upon name would come in there. And so I got to be around all my heroes. And I started shooting. I forget I'm not on my computer anymore. I started shooting around DC. So of course I shot the drum circle. Anyone who's been to drum circle knows that there's tons of photographers there. So I started shooting little projects around town, and I started taking my work and I started getting slaughtered, right? People would like, I'd go into Geographic and they'd be like, this picture absolutely sucks. I don't know why you're showing me this. And I was like, okay, well, there we go. So I did that for a while, and I was like probably there for about a year and a half, and then I started like kind of feeling like, I was like, all right, well, like the buzz of being at Geographic wore off, because at first it was really nice like to have an identity in DC. I lived in this group house. All my housemates worked at like super impressive NGOs, and they worked at think tanks, and they worked at embassies, and I felt like I had an identity when it came with that. You know, DC is a very professional town. I feel like we all kind of show up with this idea of who we're supposed to be, and that's a little bit of city life in general. But that had started to wear off, and I started to feel stuck, right? And when you're stuck, you're like really receptive to signals people are setting you, because you're looking for a way out. You want somebody to toss you a rope. And the guy who tossed me a rope, this guy, Mick Davies. He was a Geographic guy. He was like this wonderkind. I think he's about my age, maybe even just a couple years younger, but at that time he was like 23, 24, and he had won Emmys, and he had traveled all over the world, and he was an early adopter of really like digital doc video. And I was in the cafeteria because one of the things that came with my volunteer pass was a $3.50 like free lunch that I would go. And Geographic at that time, like DC is like upscaled a lot since then, but that was the big deal cafeteria in town. All right, because you go around, they had like several different types of cheesecake. It was amazing. And Mick said to me, I was like, I don't know, Mick, I don't know what I'm gonna do. He's like, listen, man, you can hang around here and like wait for somebody to discover you. You can go do something. And so that was all I kind of needed to hear. So I decided to go do something. So the next day I bought a ticket to India. And the reason I chose India is because one of the stories when I was growing up was my grandma telling me about the Jews of Cochin. And at this point, I was really interested in my own Jewish identity. And this is a theme that I'm going to kind of like talk about a little here. What my tool has given me an ability to do is to pursue the things that I really find interesting. But Toni Morrison also had a quote, you know, obviously like they gave me freedom, and I looked up freedom quotes, and gazillions would come across. But one from Toni Morrison really stuck with me, which is, being free is just one thing, but reclaiming ownership over your freed self is an entirely different thing. And I think that that was something that I struggled with then, and I still struggle with now. And so I'm gonna kind of walk you through this idea. So in Cochin, I got to really explore like Jewish identity and pluralism. There was a very old Jewish community. There was a spice port in that part of India on the southwestern coast of Kerala. And because of that, all the world would come to Kerala. And so it had all this, it had Jews and Muslims and Christians and Hindus coexisting at the time. And here's actually like 4 fishermen casting their first net. This guy's Hindu, this guy's Muslim, and these 2 men are Christian. They're all doing their morning prayer at the same time. So this also like gave me a sense of like what religion is and plurality. And this was also post 9/11, so we had this very clear idea of what was right and what was wrong, and those were others and those weren't us. And I was really interested in kind of like opening up that idea, and the idea that like that not everybody is the same, but we can all still get along just fine. And Cochin really kind of like showed me that idea. And it also gave me an opportunity to explore like larger spirituality in India. So I got to go to Varanasi. I spent a lot of time in Mumbai. I spent time with Jain priests and temples. And it really like helped me understand the world in a larger context. But I came back and I put on this big show. Actually, go back to this up. I came back, I put on a big show, and like all of a sudden I got attention. You know, Washington Post gave me a write-up. I felt like my work said something about me. I had this like story that nobody else had really like tried to tell. I tried to tell it in a new way, but I wasn't figuring out how to make a living with this. It was nice to have all this attention, but it's still like nobody was really paying me. A couple of people would pick up prints. The people at Geographic actually loved the piece, but they're like, yeah, it's not really like the right story for us right now. So I still didn't really have a roadmap on how to like monetize this interest that I have. So I went back to grad school. I'll just stay on this slide now. I went back to grad school in ethnobotany. I was really interested in biological anthropology and plant-based medicines. But the whole time I was in grad school, I really had this idea. I was like, I just want to get out and shoot again. I just want to get out and shoot again. I really feel like something's happening now. I feel like something is brewing in my life. And what I did is I used my senior thesis project to go live with the Cuna in Panama, with the traditional medicine men down there, and to see how they gathered their medicine and what kind of cultural tools that they used to create healing and to combat certain things that were in their society. So they had a lot of autosomal recessive disorders. Basically, there's a lot of inbreeding that happens amongst the Cuna. They're a small tribe off the coast of Panama. But the most interesting thing for me was that the Kuna represented a culture that had not bought into all the things that we had bought into. Right? It was very different. This was an indigenous culture that still lived very low and connected to the land. When I say there was a lot of inbreeding in the community, that's only because they had been so culturally insular. They didn't let outsiders come in. Spanish conquistadors couldn't take them over. When the Americans came down with the Panamanian Authority and tried to take over some of the territory, the Kuna didn't love them. Nothing could really like untie the Kuna from their cultural traditions. And this was the most fascinating thing I found, which was the strength of culture to maintain a way of life and a powerful connection that created with the world around us. And it also taught me that like I didn't need all the things that I needed here. You know, it made me contextualize all the stuff that we take on in our world that we don't really need. Because if you think about it, you're already bought into this stuff until once you show up, right? Another lady this morning, I was talking about freedom, and she was like, listen, your first map of freedom is your parents. You're walking around the house and you're like touching stuff, and they're like, no, you can't touch that. Don't do that. Don't do this. So you kind of grow up with these boundaries, and right, all of life is about kind of like slashing these boundaries down and seeing which ones work for you and which ones don't. And for me, I realized that like life as I had known it up until this point and this comfortable kind of like middle-class existence was actually not working for me, as it were. And that like ideas of like creating your own livelihood and being self-sustainable and all these things were something that we had lost touch with a little bit. And then I really wanted to go and kind of see Africa. Africa was this other place that I really wanted to see. I had this curiosity about it. I never had a chance to really explore it. And so I went to Ethiopia and to East Africa. And while I was over there, it was actually the first time I got work. There was some people from the UN, and they happened to know somebody who knew a photographer in town. They said, oh, we have all these water and sanitation and health projects going on around the country. Would you be willing to document them for us? And so it gave me an opportunity to start taking my craft out in the world and to monetize it and to contextualize other people's stories and to like work for missions that other people wanted me to do. And I'm going to buzz through this because I said I had so many slides that I wanted to get through. But again, I still didn't know how I was going to come back to America and make a living. And I needed something. We were all kind of like we push, and we're like, what's going to work for us? What's going to give us that ability? And the first thing that we're most looking for is financial freedom, right? This is the first freedom that most of us look for in creativity. They're like, how can I use my craft? How can I make a living with it? And what we need generally is that lucky break. And that lucky break for me came with Travel Channel at the time. They had seen all the travel work I had done. They had seen me making my friends look cool on the road. And I had actually a small representation, thanks to somebody in this room, with Getty Photography. And Getty had taken a look at my work, and they said, hey, can you do this thing that you do with your friends? Can you do it with our television hosts? And I said, sure, you know. So it got me out into the world. I got to hang out with Bourdain and Zimmer, and I got to go to Samoa and Thailand and Alaska and Vietnam and Amsterdam and all these things. And it also allowed me to work on my cultural work on the side. So it was really like this kind of perfect fit. But it was also this weird little fit for me because editorial photography and commercial photography, these are like very different worlds. It's actually one of the few crafts where they say, oh, you're a commercial photographer, or you're an editorial photographer, you're a doc photographer. For some reason, there's all these like boundaries very much set up with photography, but I wasn't really interested in those boundaries. I wanted to know how to make a living, but I still wanted to do the stories that are important to me. And I thought that I had a real eye for culture at the time, but I didn't know how to express it. And this gave me that opportunity to kind of do both things. They wanted to have pictures of places and people and the hosts at the same time. So it was about kind of putting everything in context. It also gave me the opportunity to talk with people that were like me, that were like really travelers for the first time. You know, the thing about Bourdain and Zimmer and all those guys, they're actually, they travel. They are who they are. They say they are. You know, they live for storytelling, and they live for sharing, and they live for the experience. So the same thing that drove them to their passions are the same thing that drove me. And the first time I felt like, okay, I have like this identity, you know, I can walk back into the world. I can walk back to DC and people are like, I can say I have a job, you know. It's nice to say you have a job, you know. And it's also like nice to have like recognizable symbols, right? Like whenever you're talking to grandma, she's like, what are you doing with yourself? And you have to be like, well, grandma, I'm working with the Travel Channel. Oh, I love that show, you know. So like to have things that they can point to that are tangible are like really big deals. But I didn't really still feel like I'd gotten the chance to do the journalistic storytelling that I had come in to do the field. And at that time, I was spending a lot of time in one of the original co-working spaces in town, which is the Affinity Lab. I don't know if you guys have ever been there, but it was one of the OG like co-working spaces. And I would just like, guess what I would do there? I would just hang out. And I would just show up. And there are all these like really cool and wonderful like businesses in there, and they're all focused on one of the things. But one of the people I met was this with this gentleman named Josh Goldblum, and he was my age, and I actually like walked up to him because I thought he was someone else, and I said, "Hey, didn't we meet last week?" And he's like, "No, we didn't meet." And I was like, "Yeah, we were talking about my photography." He's like, "No, but I'm looking for photographers." And what Josh wanted to do at that time was do interactive storytelling. Now, what was happening in the field at that time, this is about 2001, 2002, 2003, you guys have all heard about the magazine industry. Well, the magazine industry and the newspaper industry and the journalism industry as a whole was like suffering. And everybody kept telling me that I was getting into a dead-end career. And all I know is I couldn't get work at all because it felt like there was an ever-decreasing amount of work for an ever-increasing amount of photographers. And I was like, well, I was never like very good at like competition, and I wasn't necessarily good at schmoozing. I didn't really know the right meetings to go to. I hadn't gone to journalism school, and I found that the opportunities were very limited for me. And so I ended up talking to Josh, and he's like, well, I want to do some interactive storytelling. I want to figure out how to tell stories in new ways. And I was like, wow, this is a really cool opportunity. And so after Katrina in 2006, we went down to New Orleans. We did a project called Yearbook 2006, where we gave an interactive yearbook to the only public high school to reopen in New Orleans. And we got all the kids that were displaced and all the kids that stayed in New Orleans, and we told all their stories. And then we wove them together digitally. And it was something that you could only do in that context, right? You could never do this on print-based publications. So using the web to tell new stories in new ways. And most of the things that were happening on that at the web at that time were just reformatting old things, right? You would go to the newspaper and you would just scroll down and you would read it. So they weren't using the strength of the web to do that storytelling. And then a couple of years after we did that New Orleans project, we got a call from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, talk about doing a project on HIV in Jamaica. And this was something that was very near and dear to my heart. I'd really like kind of done a lot of work around disease and epidemiology, and I'd also done a lot of work around Jamaica and the West Indies, and I was really fascinated in it. And it got us down to tell the story of a lot of different people in Jamaica that were living with this disease. And the story we wanted to tell was not the story that you generally hear around HIV and AIDS, which is suffering and misery, and that's what a lot of the coverage had been to that point, but actually living with the disease and coping with the disease. This was a turning point in the disease. Like antiretrovirals had taken off. AZT had only been the drug up until that point, but once these retrovirals showed up, people could live long lives with the disease. And this was really interesting to me, especially in a place like Jamaica, where you're so stigmatized, right? There's so much stigmatization around the idea of having a disease. But it used to be when you had the disease, you had 5 years to live. Now you have 20, 30 years to live. So it gave us an opportunity to go and tell stories around there that people were like coming out for the first time, admitting that they had the disease, and were taking pride around what it could do for their communities if they conquered it and challenged it in the right ways. And what we did is I combined with a storyteller named Kwame Dawes, who was this wonderful, wonderful poet, and we had this idea of doing poetry and still photography at the same time. And so the idea from that came from this thought I had in my head that prose is to poetry as like still photography is to video, right? Where you could take these very select moments that are really emotionally impactful and lay them against words. So I'm going to play one of the clips. And it's an interactive online website that you guys can see. I'll share with you, but this is just one of the videos that was on the website.
Nickel, how coolly it has broken you, trying to mask the knowing wit behind your eyes. Every smile, brilliant against your gleaming black skin, is defiance. You stammer, push out words, tell your story, slap your knees to show where your stroke-frozen body would crawl across the concrete to reach the yard with the gawking onlookers. You laugh, man must live, man must live. How casually broken. Tall, lanky man, hands clawed, yams dangling, and the sweet clubman's charm in your grin still. All those women slain by your art. You stretch out your legs, tell your story slow, persistent as the crawl you made towards sunlight, the way you pulled your body upright, the way you made tender the toughness of hard men who would soon wash you, feed you with oily fingers full of mashed ackee and tomatoes, who have held you against the night, men tough as teeth, hard men. Man must live, man must live. The virus stalks through your blood, manages to tickle, make you laugh at a new sunny day, and yours is the posture of survival.
It's a weird next slide, but you get it. Go back here. So you kind of, the project ended up being really powerful for me. I knew, first of all, I was in a place that I knew that when I was producing the work, it had some resonance to it, that it had depth. You know, it wasn't just something I was doing because I was getting paid, which I actually wasn't getting paid, and that's another lesson in here. But because there was power in these stories, and you could feel it coming through. And I felt like I was like doing my job as a conduit to tell these stories. And with that, there came recognition. So this was an interactive website, and we were able to do really well, mostly at the time because like traditional journalism was going through like a bit of an identity crisis, and nobody really knew where photography was going. Nobody really knew where storytelling was going, and we were stuck. And when you're stuck, you try new things, right? Like I said, you're looking for that rope, the line out, and I couldn't get in, so I was forced to kind of go these new routes, these little outside routes with these new fellows. And so I worked with Josh to produce a website with the Pulitzer Center, and we were able to like, we did well. We won an Emmy, we won a Webby, and we won a South by Southwest award with this project. And I always say that because it was the first time that I felt like there was like recognition to my journalism work as well, and I didn't feel necessarily confined just as a commercial photographer. And I feel like a lot of my career has always been like kind of trying to break out of like how I feel ideologically caged in, you know, and like kind of like trying to strike out of that into the wider world. But I still realized that making money strictly through journalism was really going to be a tough thing. And so I needed to do a combination of like advertising projects and journalism and personal projects and all these things. And I'm going to kind of walk you through some of these right now, just to kind of, I figured what would be interesting to people is how you balance these things out, right? How do you work on personal work versus how do you get paid work? And so what I started doing is I was like, all right, I need to like start doing much more advertising work. It pays better. So I started showing up on advertising sets and shooting still photos for those. And there I found a lot of interest because it gave me an opportunity to really hone my craft, right? One of the things my bubby used to say, I'll bring the bubby up again, which is, if you're good at what you do, you can make a living doing anything. And for a while I was just like, okay, yeah, obviously, bubby. But through my life, that's really like come to be true, right? Which is like hone this craft, like really, really know everything, and know everything that you have to do commercial lighting, know everything you have to do journalistic writing, know how to connect with people. If you have all these skill sets in place, you'll always find a way to exploit those skill sets in a way that can drive you to your passions and your interests. And so I use that. I would take small assignments just because it gave me access to John Waters and meet in literally super grocery marts in Baltimore. So here's John Waters stealing meat in the store, Santa's busting him. I spent a lot of time, as I said, in New Orleans and the West Indies, working around music ideals in Jamaica. I've now kind of explored the work in a different way, where I do a lot of work for local brands. If you guys know Sweet Green, I do all their photography. So if you see their monthly salads, I also shoot those of all things. But I also shoot the Sweet Life concert every year, and I gave them the idea of doing behind-the-scenes photography at the Sweet Life Festival. And this is right around the time Instagram was just coming out, so you could do these photo booths and these backstage scenes and send them to the people at the front of the concert house so they could see what was going on. We got to hang out with Solange. Now, like. But Jay was cool too. But Queen Bey is where it's at. So I actually showed these projects only because I want you to understand that like you never know what you're getting into when you get into something. For this shot, I got hired by Gibson Guitar because it was the Obama inauguration, and Jay-Z was putting on a concert at the Warner Theater at the time. And it was the night before the inauguration, and Gibson was having this guitar signed, right? So they wanted pictures of the celebrity signing the guitar, because they need that for verification when they auction it off. The guitar was going to be auctioned off to support USO. And I was kind of there, and I was like hanging out, and like they were like, don't move, you don't have a backstage pass, you're not allowed to be here. And I was just kind of like hanging out like this the whole time. And all of a sudden the show started, you know, Mary J comes out on stage, and all these people are kind of going by me, and I just hear this thumping out front, and all this sudden the security guards all go to the front of the house, and I kind of like wander in the side stage door. And I'm just like hanging out with these guys, and I was like, when are they going to kick me out? But they didn't kick me out, and it gave me access. This is still one of my favorite, pictures of all time, because I feel like a lot of times you see Jay, he's always like king cool, right? But like this is like this moment of pride. Like Barack Obama is being elected tomorrow, and you can just see this like sense of like relief and accomplishment, and that the world has changed. Like to me, like all that's in this picture actually, and it's kind of like looking at your little brother, being like, man, we really did it. Can you believe we're here? And it's such a cool experience, and Bey was the same thing, man. She was just, this is her sitting on the side, the cinder block wall. don't let anybody ever say anything bad about that lady. She truly is a queen. She really was. I'll tell you a story about that picture at some point. But also like being backstage with Hillary as she's like preparing notes. These type of things were the stuff that I really liked. It was not just like shooting somebody on stage, but those little moments inside and out of. Unfortunately, the vertical photos got cropped, but these are longer images. But you know, Wale, you know, all these, even like in DC, everything I wanted to exploit. This was Nadav Kander's this super famous photographer, and he was shooting this campaign for Puma, but I like got hired to do behind the scenes stuff, and I got to spend some time with Usain Bolt. So this is like kind of talking about virtuous cycle stuff, right? Like you show up for work, you don't know what's going to be there. It may not be the assignment you want. It may not be like exactly as glamorous as you think it should be, but still show up because everything is like the stepping stone. You know, I always say like, can you get work by doing work? You know, and if you show up with that right attitude and that spirit, it will change everything for you. Diplo is another one of those guys. Again, unfortunately, this is like a much cooler vertical shot, but I literally had like Diplo for 5 minutes, and we were walking down the street, and there was this auto body shop where the guy who made keys, and I was like, will you duck in here with me? And he was like cool about it. He just like kind of stepped in there with me. This is for Acorn. I got hired by Acorn, the fair housing opportunity. People that don't exist anymore, so you may not know it. They got kind of killed by the Republicans about 4 or 5 years ago, but they literally had no budget, and they said, you know, Ted Kennedy is going to speak at one of our rallies. Would you mind coming out and shooting? And I was like, sure. And I got there, and this still is one of my favorite pictures to this day. You know, and I think it just says like, if your head's in the game, like everything is kind of available to you at all times. You know, like you kind of like make your own access in a lot of these cases. So I'm just kind of going you through some of the work I do. This is a project I recently did for Washingtonian on a boxer here in DC, Dusty Hernandez. This is a region project I did for New Balance sneakers. So this is where I say, this is where I want to start kind of contextualizing freedom, right? Because like I was able to get work, I was able to make a living. But that's very different than reclaiming ownership over your freed self, right? So I'd been freed, and I was in this hustle of like economic freedom. Economic freedom makes me free. If I have money, then no one controls me, and then I can do what I want. And according to the lady coming up the elevator, freedom is doing what you want, when you want, how you want. Which is what I thought too. But it's not really that. Freedom is how you use the choices that you have and the opportunities you have towards your values, towards the places that you want to go, right? Because to be free just for the sake of freedom is actually nothing. Like freedom with purpose is something, right? But to be free is nothing unless you own that freedom and you claim that freedom. So over the last couple of years, even though I've kind of kept doing a lot of this advertising work and the stuff that I enjoy, I've really started to focus my work on project-based work, on long-form narrative, also on like wider and expansive storytelling for different clients. So this was a project I did on indigenous culture and industry in Alaska for a town called Ketchikan. It's in southeastern Alaska, if any of you guys have been there. And it's a fascinating place. I kind of call it the New Orleans of the North. It's all like industry and culture. That's how they kind of make their living. A lot of cruise ships stop through there, so that's how they're able to fund having a photographer come up and tell the story of their people. But it also gave me a lot of access to things that I would never see. Old growth forests being clear stripped for the first time. You unfortunately don't get to see this picture. The vertical ones didn't craft so well. Spending time with some of the oldest and legendary bush pilots in the game was a really neat experience. And listening to and I don't actually get political about this because I want you to know that as they felled these trees, the trees were going to support indigenous community schools. So it's not like it's just being clear logged down. It was also being sent to Japan to rebuild the houses that were over there. But I can tell you growing up as a very kind of like knee-jerk environmentalist, hearing a 600-year-old tree fall in the forest, it makes a noise. You know, you feel it. It makes this incredible groan as it falls. And so, like, to me, again, all this was kind of getting out there and making my world bigger and pushing out and seeing all the different places that I could go and interact and feel like I wasn't a total stranger or an outsider. And then it was also the opportunity at this point to use my interests and my free time to explore identity issues within myself. And so, like, we all kind of take on these projects, right? Because, like, there's an existential nature about them. Like, they're like, what does it tell me about me when I learn about them? Or what can I use as a frame of reference? So I got interested in the idea of doing like a feature-length documentary with a couple of friends of mine. I'd done a couple of multimedia projects. I'd worked a little bit in video. But I became very interested in, like, how do you do a feature-length film? And so I had a good friend, Jim Goldblum, who came up with the idea in this project, in this, it's self-called a slum, but I don't want to call it. I want to say a very dense village in Delhi. Let's put it that way. And it was a magician's colony. It was the last magician's colony in New Delhi. And they were about to get totally razed to make way for India's first skyscraper. Interestingly enough, for New Delhi's first skyscraper. That was going to be called the Phoenix, of all the things of irony. But this area got slated for development. It was all going to be wiped out and taken away. And we wanted to go and figure out what that meant. At the same time, I had a studio at the Gold Leaf Studio that was being swept away to make way for condos. So I thought there was like an interesting resonance in there for me. And as I spent time with these traditional craftsmen, I got to see how, as an artist, do you feel safe in the world? How do you have to modify your craft? What things have to change so you can survive into the future? What things don't? There was the option for a lot of the craftsmen there were these jobs if they stopped pursuing their craft. And so I'm going to play you a clip from that movie. And this clip's also actually about honing your craft. And this is Maya. She's the acrobat who you see in this picture. And she's going to tell you a little bit about how the acrobats in the... I think this... Oh, I have to hit it again.
हमारे जो ट्रेडिशनल जो एक्रोबेट यहाँ से स्टार्ट करते हैं जब छोटा होता बच्चा पैदा होता है 8 या 9 महीने का होता है तो वहाँ से ही स्टार्ट कर देते हैं उसे मोड़ना हाथ पे उठाना उसे ऐसे करके मोड़ दिया कभी उसका पैर उठा के इधर लगा दिया कभी उसका हाथ इधर पकड़ा दिया पैर को हमारे खानदान में वो बच्चे का पहले से ही डर मार देते तो वो बड़ा होता तो उसको डर नहीं लगता है हाँ जब सरिया मोड़ने का स्टार्ट करा था मैंने वो पतली सरिया से स्टार्ट करा था पहले ही पूरा जख्मी हो गया था मेरा ये अंदर का खाना भी नहीं खाया जाता था तो उन्होंने ट्रेनिंग रोक दी थी कि नहीं कर सकती ये तो मोड़ लेती हूँ मैं प्राउड भी करती हूँ कि मैं एक कलाकार कॉलोनी में रहती हूँ क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ पर बच्चे को मतलब ये नहीं कहते कि बच्चों को डर नहीं होता मेरे सपने तो बहुत बड़े पता नहीं पूरे होंगे कि नहीं होंगे
So I shared that clip, A, because I wanted to start talking about craftsmanship and artistry. And I feel like the last 10 years, I'm like, I'm pushing 40 now, guys. It's getting close on. But I realized that like the last 10 years have been about developing craftsmanship, As I said, I don't think I showed an aptitude for the arts as a kid. And I think I'm just starting to understand what artistry is as an adult. And so I'm going to come back to that a little bit. I recently, do I want to talk about it? Yeah, I'm going to give you guys, this is kind of a little bit of a segue, but I recently went to Bhutan last year after that to kind of look at untouched culture. After coming back from Kathputli, where you saw this culture in threat of constantly being extinguished and put out, I wanted to see something where culture wasn't dying, where it wasn't fading. And so me and a couple of of my fellow friends were able to secure a grant. I don't know if you know, Dos Equis, by the way, has, not to product plug them, but they have the Stay Thirsty grant that I think is something close to $30,000 that you guys can go after for. So if you have a really good idea, you should apply for it. But what we applied for was the concept of happiness, exploring happiness and cultural continuity in Bhutan. And we were able to get the grant. And we trekked throughout the Himalayan mountains. We spent time at monasteries way up in the hillsides, and I got to see a culture completely intact and one that made cultural preservation a priority for itself, right? Because most of the cultures that I see when I'm traveling out are things that are fading, you know? They're things that are dying away in some way or the other. And that's something that, as an anthropologist, really bothered me, because I think like cultural diversity is like genetic diversity. The more we have, the more width of different type of behaviors that we can select from, the more likelihood that we're going to end up doing it right, you know? And Bhutan represents like a place on the spectrum that's far out, you know, in terms of cultural and environmental and individual preservation. They put happiness above anything else, right? They have gross national happiness in Bhutan. A lot of you guys know about this. And so that was an incredible project for me. But what I've now started to move into is some work for the Smithsonian. So this is a project that I just got back from doing. And this, now I kind of returned to it. The reason I kind of skipped over Bhutan was a little bit is that I wanted to talk about this idea of craftsmanship. And craftsmanship is like kind of, is just understanding how to apply the technological things that you have to do. The craftsman, you know, how to draw a good line, or how to design well, or how to photograph well. You spend so much time just kind of like focusing on the technical. When I was in college, I used to like really like to play guitar, right? And I would just like, I had this guitar and I'd rock out and I'd write these songs and I'd be like, man, these songs are great. But I had all these buddies that like could like solo Stevie Ray Vaughan, right? And they knew all the Max Lydian scales and all this thing. And when I started hanging out with them, I didn't feel like a musician anymore, you know? And I was like, oh, I'm going to learn how to do what they do. And I started like practicing scales and doing all these things. But I realized that I couldn't do what they did. I didn't have the passion for it. But photography was something that the practice was fun for me. But I had to keep doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it. And in this project we did for the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, I got to spend time with lots of other craftsmen and to see what they do and the lifetimes they put into their work. Fan makers, boat makers, herders, weavers, glass blowers. We got to go to China and Kenya and Myanmar, embroiderers, Uyghur musicians, throat singers. And I realized that through this process that like I'm just kind of coming to the point that like I have craftsmanship. You know, after years and years of like kind of putting in the point, I feel like my work's at a place technically that I'm happy with it. But now I have to work on vision, right? Now I have to work on heading out into the world and like having total freedom to be able to execute on these ideas that I have. And that's where I am right now in my process. I'm not going to go too deep because I think hopefully I'll leave a little time for questions. But I leave you with a picture of Cornelius Lamar, who's a Dutch mid-century painter in Holland. And to me, I shot him on one of the Travel Channel shoots, but to me, this is a guy, like, if I look at this guy's freedom, he actually lives an entirely medieval lifestyle, except for the fact that he has electricity in his house. But even these player pianos and all these things, these paintings, he makes and he sells. And he sells these paintings for $50,000, $100,000 as a Dutch mid-century artist, right? So he's like kind of encapsulated this whole life, right? Imagine if you could do that. You could have any life that you want. Cornelius to me was the proof that you could have any life that you want. But you have to decide out what you're in pursuit of and what you really want and how you want to use your freedoms as an artist. And I think that's not a very strong summation, but that's my summation.